But long before I was a taxman, so to speak, I was an activist. And part of that was that I was a pharmacist who used to dish out Panados and flu tablets. And now I'm required to see how we can cook up some medication which will give us jobs, growth and development in South Africa. When one talks about, and let me also thank the university and the organizers for this opportunity to interact with you. I thought campuses went to sleep at 5 o'clock, but this is quite an honor to have so many of you here this evening. And excuse me, I have this bad cough, so which will interrupt me every now and again. I'm going to make 7 or 8 points at the beginning, and then we can all have a debate. But before I make those points, when we talk about 20 years of democracy, it's actually very useful, particularly for our young South Africans, and even those who are not South Africans who are amongst us, to just take a short journey. 24 years ago, April 1990, the ANC, an organization that I was affiliated with by now for over 40 years, had just been unbanned for a couple of months. Many of us were part of an underground structure of the ANC, and 24 years ago, we were told, stay in place, because we don't quite know where these negotiations with our enemy would actually take us. 24 years ago, in April, the first accord was signed. I think it was called the Kruger Accord, between Mr. Mandela on the one hand and Mr. de Klerk on the other hand. And that accord said, we both express our common intent to negotiate a better future for South Africa. The next 4 years, or at least, the next 3.5 years proved that that intent wasn't necessarily a common intent. So saying, yes, I unban the ANC, I release Mr. Mandela, I release everybody on Robben Island, I allow exiled people to come back home, I will allow your underground cadres to actually emerge, didn't necessarily mean that we were free. 23 years ago, April 1991, there was a little bit more confidence that we might get to proper negotiations. By August 1990, the ANC volunteered and said we will suspend armed struggle. A whole lot of us were still in detention at the time. And April was still an early phase in the discussions. But at about that time, more violence actually started in South Africa. And so it was only 22 years ago, April 1992, when real talks were getting off the ground, so-called CODESA 2. And a month later, in May 1992, the realization emerged that the then government was still intensifying violence against black people. So on black violence actually came to the fore. The murders in Boipatong and other townships came to the fore. And in May 1992, the first set of CODESA talks collapsed. Because essentially, the National Party then said, we want, yes, we'll give you one person, one vote elections, we will give you a nominal democracy, but we will create a second chamber that will have a veto on all democratic decisions. And most South Africans, of course, have forgotten all about all of this. So it's useful, I'm sure, to remind you a little bit. 21 years ago, April 1993, we were into the first month of real negotiations. Having signed between Mr. Mandela and Mr. de Klerk a national peace accord, part of which was the first time that the then ruling government said, we concede to a one-person, one-vote constituent assembly that will draft the new constitution of South Africa. And that was the turning point of what we celebrate today as 20 years of democracy. It was about the 10th of April, 1994, when Chris Hani was assassinated. I beg your pardon, 1993. And it was a few days later that we had a planning committee in the negotiating process that met, and that planning committee had a proposal from the ANC, let's declare the 27th of April 1994 as the first democratic elections for South Africa. And so the first democratic elections happened on the 27th of April 1994. 20 years ago then, leading up to the 27th of April 1994, wasn't an easy time either. Negotiations had been concluded in early December. We had an interim constitution. We established a transitional executive council, and I was a privileged bystander in many of these structures. But the 2 months leading up to the elections, you had, today we have a very stable IEC, we have an electoral machinery, but Judge Johan Krickler, together with the team, was given the task of organizing the first democratic elections in South Africa. And remember, no machinery existed in South Africa to cater for all of its people. This was the first time that all citizens over the age of 18 who registered to vote would have the right to vote. This was also the time, and I think the Star newspaper is carrying some interesting reflections on that period, when the IFP in KwaZulu-Natal had to be persuaded over time, particularly by President Zuma, to become a participant in the elections as opposed to standing out. And there were other people as well during this time. So the first of the 20th years didn't arrive easily for South Africa. It was a tough struggle, lots of skillful negotiations, lots of persuading that we can make a democratic South Africa work. The second point I want to make is that what did the period after the 27th of April actually mark for South Africans? So yes, we had the first democratic elections, but more importantly, it was the task of the first democratic government under President Mandela to actually have a vision of a different South Africa from the one that existed at that point in time. Not 8 Bantustans, 4 so-called independent Bantustans, an Indian tricameral chamber, a colored tricameral chamber. How many of you knew about this, by the way? Too few, you see. So when we got into government in 1994, now my count is 14, but some say it's 18, but 14 departments of education existed. Departments of health, departments of welfare. So that was the period when we began to reorganize the apartheid state into what we today have as 20 years of the democratic state. Something we take for granted, something we think just appeared on the stage. Many of the first ministers in Mr. Mandela's cabinet had nothing in their offices when they walked in. No ruler, no paper, no assistant. When we walked into Parliament for the first time, we had no experience to run a parliamentary system. But there were excellent cadres of the ANC who had a vision of an open, democratic, participatory parliament. And together we created a new parliamentary system. It's something that still needs to be done a lot more effectively than we've done today, up to this point in time. So my second main point is that assuming government authority under an interim constitution, but at the same time drafting a new constitution, wasn't the only thing we did. The key was to actually begin the process of transformation. And many of the reflections about 20 years of democracy are about how much did we transform South Africa from the apartheid that we had during that time to a very different democratic society and ethos that we actually have today. Where did we make progress? Where did we have shortcomings? And where indeed have we failed in this process? Because this is not a smooth journey. No human endeavor allows you to get 100% mark. I'm sure many of the lecturers here are very familiar with that, let alone the students. But the ANC had documents like the Ready to Govern document, the Reconstruction and Development Program, and other programs which it thought were going to transform South Africa, in many ways did transform South Africa as well. But we often talk about these things as if there's only the hard elements in the transformation process: housing, education, health, democratic institutions. But it was also about the soft elements, where black people in particular could say, I can walk around the streets hesitantly in the early years, much more confidently later, with a sense of dignity, with a sense of self-respect, with a sense of self-worth, coming from a society where little of that actually was accorded them. And also get used to the idea that both the interim constitution and the final constitution had a Bill of Rights and accorded those rights to us in many, many different ways. The third point to make is South Africa is not an island. What happened then, what happened later, and what happens now, and what goes on in the future is also partly dependent on the context in which we find ourselves. Meaning, what kind of economic system and ethos is dominant in the world? How integrated are you into global markets and global value chains and global economic systems? To what extent are some of the great transitions that are taking place in the globe giving us more space to do progressive things in South Africa rather than limiting some of those spaces? So as I'm sure many of you know, we're getting a kind of geopolitical and geoeconomic shift from the west to the east and the south. We know that China today is the second biggest economy in the world. We know that many of the reform struggles that we are debating in the IMF just this past weekend is about big countries like China and India saying we want our rightful place and a rightful voice in those fora, so that we can co-determine the kind of governance rules that will determine where the world goes in many of the issues that are confronting it. But equally, if I come fast forward to today and share a few lessons with you about the last 3 or 4 days that I spent in Washington, we live in a world where the Great Recession has had a massive impact across the world, including in South Africa. We live in a world where the recovery is a very gradual one, but very uncertain one. We live in a world where one day, over the last 3 or 4 years, emerging markets and developing economies like our own were indispensable to the welfare of the global economic system. And had it not been for the kind of stimulus policies that most emerging markets and developing countries implemented, global growth would have collapsed totally and would have gone into not just a Great Recession, but the next Great Depression after 70 years from the previous one. But we also live in a world where sentiment swings very easily. Where one day South Africa is a good, safe destination for investment, and the next day it isn't. So 2 months ago, if you spoke to me, your first question to me would have been, why are we part of the Fragile Five? Today I saw an article somewhere, is the Fragile Five in fact going to become the Formidable Five? Where the Rand had gone to 11.30, 40, 50. Today it's at 10.51, 10.56 or something like that. So there's lots of swings that are taking place. And in those swings, and inherent in those swings, are in fact a contestation between emerging markets and their social policies and the way they approach development, and they tackle poverty, and they tackle inequality, and the way in which the so-called Western world tackles it. And so every now and again in these international fora, we would be the subject of a finger-pointing exercise which says, get your house in order. It happened last year when Ben Bernanke was then chairman of the Federal Reserve of the United States, said we're going to to tapering. How many of you have heard of that word? Quantitative easing. Prof, we've got to do some work here. So the United States, up to December last year, was pumping $85 billion a month into their system, and at very low interest rates, if not zero. And so that led to what is called a carry trade, where you borrow cheap money in the United States and you come here and you earn 8% interest, and the difference is what you take back home as profit. But that's very volatile capital flows and are open to all sorts of geopolitical sentiments. And we can talk about that a bit more as we go. So we live in a globe where, interestingly, in the last year or so, poverty and inequality are becoming, and jobs are becoming big issues. And again, it's the discourse emerging from developing countries which has brought these issues on the table, but also developments in developed economies where they also, countries like Spain and others, have identical unemployment numbers to us. Unemployment generally around 24%, unemployment generally amongst young people of close to between 40 and 50%, which is what we are confronted with as well. So a big debate around the world at the moment, and of course one in South Africa as well, is what's the right growth path? What is the growth path that will give you the right GDP numbers, that will reduce inequality, result in a more enterprising economy, create more jobs, particularly for young people, give us, in our kind of context, a more competitive edge than we currently have in a world that is very competitive, and even in an African continent that's very competitive as well. So context matters. What we see around on the African continent is also the positive side of this context. Today, all sorts of South African businesses are all over the continent. Retail, telecommunications, hospitality, financial industry, etc. And they're doing a rollicking trade and hopefully benefiting their destination economies as much as they benefit South Africa as well. So an interesting topic is how do we make sure, and what are the practices that will ensure that both South Africa benefits, but also other countries benefit from these forms of investment. South Africa is, in fact, if you take the resource sector out, the biggest foreign direct investor on the African continent today, not China. China is the biggest investor in the resource economy. But what model of investment are we going to pursue in those countries is an interesting question. My fourth point is that in the past 20 years, as we reflect over this period, we have fundamentally changed the lives of people. I'll just give you some data. In 1996, 58% of people had access to electricity. In 2011, it's almost 85%. Water, 60% in 1996, about 74% in 2011, and it's better now. Sanitation, 50% then, 60-odd% now. Social welfare, 2.4 million people in 1996, and 15.3 million, almost 16 million now. And without the kind of safety net that we built up, partly because we collected more taxes from you, so thank you for that. But that enabled us to do the kind of things that we've actually done. So living standards have improved. There are less people in the bottom 3 LSMs today than there were even 10 years ago. More people in the sort of lower end of the middle class, battling with certain sorts of issues, but they've raised themselves from the bottom 3 LSMs in South Africa. We've all heard about black diamonds. We've heard about the buying power of the black middle class. So there have been all sorts of changes. At the same time, I think we must admit that over the past 20 years, on the one hand, we've failed to make sure that everybody rises out of the bottom 3 LSMs. We have had shortcomings in terms of delivery on the ground, because the state machinery often is not strong enough and effective enough to deliver as well. So if you go forward to the next 20 years, there's a lot of hard work to do to be more inclusive in terms of the kind of way in which we grow in our economy. I'll come back to this. But more importantly, build on the improvement in the living standards of our people that we've achieved over the last 20 years. My fifth point is around nation building. Again, given our past, one doesn't expect the click of a finger or the signing of a constitution to actually say, I hereby declare that you are now a non-racial, non-sexist new nation. Nation building is a long historical process. But the kind of pride, unity, and cohesion that we showed, say, around the 2010 FIFA World Cup, was testimony to the fact that we are capable of reaching heights of cohesion that we normally wouldn't in our environment. And we've come a long way in terms of the kind of friction and problematic interfaces that we would have had, even though there is still a lot more work to do to genuinely build non-racialism in our society, genuinely respect diversity in our society, genuinely ensure that we are not sexist in the way we actually behave, and give women a lot more opportunities than they actually have. So you can decide later how many marks you give to ourselves in terms of building the kind of nation that we wanted to build, but recognize at the same time the kind of progress that we've made. What about the next 20 years? Again, if you look at our economic stats, GDP numbers, our economy has grown 2.5 to 3 times from where we were. In 1994, we were collecting 114 billion rands of tax. On the 31st of March this year, we collected 899.7 billion rands of tax. It shows you how far we've come as a society, because if you don't pay, we don't collect. So those of you that haven't started working, just remember that. Similarly, we've built up reserves from 3 billion rands to 50 billion rands, and we need to do a lot more work in that regard. So if you look at many of the base stats in our economy, we've made huge progress in 20 years. But at the same time, there's a lot of work to do. So what are the areas where we need to work harder? Firstly, we need a lot more entrepreneurship and small businesses in South Africa. The structure of our economy is such that we haven't been able to overcome some of the legacies of the past fast enough, and as a result create the kind of energy that many other developing countries show at the lower end of the economic spectrum. Second, many international studies show that our economy is also very concentrated. So they will talk about product market concentration or oligopolistic practices in many sectors of our economy as well. Now, how do we, on the one hand, build national champions, but on the other hand, allow for more competition within our economy is part of the contradiction that we have to manage over the next 2 years. The third is there isn't enough black economic ownership and participation in our economy. So despite 20 years of progress, despite BEE, despite the kind of codes and so on that we've produced, yes, there's a significant segment of our people that have benefited, but those benefits are still over a narrow base. A lot more work needs to be done to ensure that ordinary folk have assets, that ordinary folk have something they can call their wealth that they can pass on from generation to generation. I'm sure you know more about William Piketty's most recent book, Capital in the 21st Century, than I do, but it's an interesting reflection on how inequality develops and has developed in developed economies, and how it reproduces itself in our kind of economy. And the challenge will be, how do we avoid that kind of pitfall and develop a growth model that's very different and a lot more inclusive than the one we have. The second is we have a national development plan. And what we need is a social compact, an agreement, a deal, call it what you will, which will get us to focus on the things we can collectively deliver in South Africa from all sections of society, while we continue to debate that which needs to be debated. But at the moment, in some sectors we seem to be paralyzed by debate, whilst in other sectors a sense of urgency hopefully will propel the implementation of the NDP. But we do require some kind of deal, if you like, which says although we've made excellent progress over the last 20 years, a lot more needs to be done, and we do have the intellectual, leadership, and financial resources to actually do much better than we've done up to this point in time, if we all put our heads and minds to it. And the second last point is better delivery to poor people. And again, this raises questions about the nature of the state. Yes, it's 20 years old and not fully formed, but there's a lot more that I think we can do, both as state, as civil society, and as the business sector, in order to make sure informal settlements disappear, bucket systems disappear, mud schools disappear, literally overnight, because we have the capability to actually do it. So how we build state capacity, as the NDP talks about it, whilst at the same time undertaking a lot more efficient participatory delivery, if you can call it that, is part of the challenge for the next 10 years or so. But lastly, I disagree, as the Prof said, with this extreme negative narrative that seems to pervade everything we discuss in South Africa. I think that it's a remarkable achievement if you go back to my 24 years and recognize where we're coming from in a very short period of time. As South Africans, we should be very proud of our achievements, and I'm sure that when you travel and you say to people, I'm from South Africa, in their heads, you are Mandela's child. In their heads, you are part of this miracle, as they would call it, because you didn't kill each other to get where you are. And there are many other examples where people have. And you are still not actually killing each other in order to build a very different kind of society. And that is a reason to be hopeful. And that is a reason to be optimistic. And had we not been optimistic in the ANC, we wouldn't be sitting here today. Because that optimism is what kept hundreds of thousands of activists and leaders alive in order to celebrate 20 years of democracy. Now, I'm sure you're going to ask many other questions as we go on, but let me not take too long and respond to some of the issues that you will raise later. Thank you very much.
Yeah, sorry. The serious bit's over for the next 15 minutes. You have to listen to me. So I've given it away. The DVC has given me a time to stick to. And I wasn't going to tell you what it is, but it may have slipped out. Yeah, thanks for the opportunity to respond to the Minister, who it's always interesting to engage with. I think a lot of what the Minister had to say I agree with, or a fair amount I have to agree with, and I think certainly the idea that we have important things to be proud of in this country is something that needs to be stressed. Like everybody else, I've been invited to write various things about where we've come from in the last 20 years, and I think that there's a great deal that we need to acknowledge. We tend to forget, and the Minister is correct to remind us of where we were 20 years ago, of what kind of disabilities people laboured under simply because they happened to be black. We tend to forget, as the Minister suggested, that one of the great ironies of our history is that the people who ran the apartheid government were convinced that if they created a black middle class, people wouldn't demand political rights. And it was only when people got the political rights that they were demanding that we started to develop the black middle class, which you see today. There are all sorts of ways in which this country has changed, and just to add one dimension, because the Minister was talking about growth issues and redistribution issues, which are also very important to me. I'm fortunate enough with some colleagues at UJ to be part of an international project at the moment on social policy in the BRICS countries. And what we're arguing is that the entire focus of attempts to use public money to address poverty and inequality in the world has shifted. What we're saying is that if you look at the textbooks, when people want to know what it is that you do to address poverty and inequality. They used to look at Western Europe, they used to look at Canada, they used to look at Australia. And what is happening in all those countries is either things are staying the same or more likely they're going backwards. What is the places where things are being challenged, the place where things are being looked at are ourselves, India, Russia, well, less Russia, but certainly ourselves, India, Brazil, and China to a certain extent. Which doesn't mean that everything is rosy, which doesn't mean that we're always doing wonderful things, but the battle over whether we are going to adequately address these issues is being fought in Brazil, it's being fought in India, it's being fought in China, and it's being fought here in South Africa. That said, I've become very interested recently, and in fact just today I sent off a book chapter to a colleague who's producing a book on this, by an idea which we call path dependence. And path dependence is basically the idea developed by a man called Douglas North, who won the Nobel Prize for Economic History, that if you look very often at periods and societies where things are changing a great deal, you discover that in fact a great deal is remaining the same in the societies despite the appearance of change. And I think that path dependency very accurately describes what has been happening in our country for the last 20 years. Because if you asked me to put it in a nutshell, I'd say that what we've done over the last 20 years is that the society, that because of the agreement of 1994, the arrangements and the institutions and the ways of doing things that we had in place in this country before 1994 have largely remained intact, except that the racial barriers have been removed and now black people can participate. And if one says that, people immediately start thinking that one is saying that nothing has changed. And it doesn't mean that nothing has changed. The idea that people are now able to participate in what was once reserved for 15% of the population is a huge change. And if you want to illustrate, I think this room that we're sitting in this evening, if we were here 20 years ago in this particular campus, would have been reserved for white people only. And that is a very important change in our society. And in fact, quite a lot of what I think has kept the society together and has enabled the society to achieve what it has over the last 20 years has been a result of path dependency. And as I wrote my chapter and I researched my chapter, which I handed in today, I became aware that a lot of this path dependency doesn't go back 20 years, it doesn't go back 60 years, it goes back 100 years. Patterns were set in this country which are still around today. And some of those are positive. The fact that despite all the horrors of the way in which black people were treated by successive types of minority government, the fact that for the minority, competitive elections were preserved has helped us. It's helped us to keep the competitive elections going. The fact that despite all the violations which were performed, there was a functioning legal system has meant that we have courts in this country which operate effectively. We have a respect for the law. We have various understandings in this country which remain intact. And then perhaps the most interesting of all, from some work I've been doing recently, is if you were to ask some people who study labor relations, what is one of the great achievements of the last 20 years, they'd tell you it was the Labor Relations Act of 1995. In fact, a former UJ colleague of mine, Sakela Bashungu, who's now Dean of Humanities at UCT, has done some very interesting work, which I certainly convinced me that in fact the current labour system is largely the 1924 Industrial Conciliation Act, which with unions by with black members absorbed into it. Now, none of this is we should be ashamed of. I mean, the fact that we have competitive elections, that people respect the electoral process, that the courts work, that people can bargain, that is tremendously important, and we need to preserve that. On the other hand, path dependency has some very negative elements to it. The first negative element, which I think it has, and there are quite a few, is what my colleague Aubrey Manchiki, who writes a newspaper column in the same newspaper that I write, Aubrey has become famous, and I think justly famous, for making the point that in his view, 20 years after democracy, the political majority is the cultural minority, as he points out. And what he's in fact saying is, although the majority has changed, the kind of cultural assumptions that we have, what is considered acceptable, what is not considered acceptable, is determined by the minority. And quite frankly, if you look at a lot of our media, you'll get a very clear sense of what I'm talking about. One of the great ironies of the last 20 years is that the people in this society who complain the most are the people who are freest and better off, and the people who complain the least are the people who are still trying to emerge out of an undemocratic past. If you live in a suburb in this country, if you're part of the middle class, not only do you have freedom of speech, you have the kind of environment where last year, I don't think this could happen in any other country than last year. Last year, I received secret emails from business people congratulating me on my bravery because I said something nice about the government in a business newspaper. Because you're not supposed to say nice things about the government anyway in the suburbs or in the business newspaper. That is the extent of freedom of speech in the suburban environment. If you go to townships and shack settlements very often, you have very tough local power holders who are used to telling people what to do, who don't like competition from citizens expressing their right, and it is very difficult to be an active citizen in many of those places because there are power holders preventing you doing it. If you live in a suburb in this country, as I do and as many people in this room do, if unfortunately the power goes out or there's a problem with services, people pick up the phone and they yell and they scream, and about an hour or two later the thing is fixed. Don't try that very often in shack settlements or townships, because you can shout for 2 or 3 days and nothing will get fixed. Now, if all this sounds familiar, it should be familiar, because that is part of the path dependency that still lives with us. And in the minister's environment, current portfolio environment, I think one of the biggest challenges we face is the extent to which that beneficial path dependence, that labour relations system which enables workers and trade unions to have a voice, which is such an essential part of democracy, how that is undermined by another form of path dependence, and that is the persistence of very high levels of poverty and inequality in this society. And yes, it's perfectly true that the lowest rungs have improved to a certain extent. But that's not actually as useful to people as it sounds, because you don't measure your living standards compared to some sort of abstract model. You measure your living standards according to the society that you're in. So if you've improved by 10% over the last 20 years, and everybody else you can see around you has improved by 50%, it's not a particularly good deal. Now, if you look at the kind of conflict that we've been having in our workplaces over the last year, which at one stage led to the shootings at Marikana, it's pretty well accepted now that the reason that we're having this conflict at the moment in many places is because there's a dialogue of the deaf between employers and workers. What happens is the employer says, we gave you a very generous increase last year, what's the problem? The workers say, we can't get by with what you gave us. And the interesting point about it is that they're both right. And the reason they're both right is that workers, and I know the ministers, the Treasury is interested in this issue, and it's been in the media quite a lot, workers are simply borrowing more than they can afford to pay back. And there are two reasons why workers are borrowing more than they can afford. The first one is that one of the path dependencies, one of the uglier sides of our history, is that throughout our society we are taught that the decent South African, the one who everybody should respect, is the person who has an iPad, or the person who has a cell phone, or the person who has various consumer goods. And if you don't believe me, have a look at the 2011 census, which tells us that more South African households have television sets than have fridges. So it's more important for South Africans to show your neighbour you have a television set than it is to keep your food edible in a fridge. And that is part of our path dependency, and that is part of our inheritance. That's an inequality problem. Because if you're a working person and you want that kind of respect and you can't afford those things, then you borrow up to the hilt to afford to buy them, and then you land up either with debts or with what in South Africa is called a garnishing order, which means that somebody deducts the money from your salary. The other thing that we're becoming aware of, which we should have been aware of, is that on average, I mean certainly some work has been done on the mines on this, but let's be quite specific. If you're a black person in this country, and you are in for a formal job, if you get a wage or a salary, the chances are that that wage or salary is being distributed among 8 to 10 dependents who are unemployed, who rely on you for resources. And that's a poverty problem. So what we have is a situation in which, together with social grants, which are one of the great achievements, and that's why I said what I did about social policy, together with social grants, those bargains that employers and workers make, those bargains are one of the lifelines that keep a lot of people able to feed themselves, etc. And there's obviously intense pressure on that as we go forward. I think one other form of path dependency, which we need to be very careful of, which is something we don't talk about, is something I have written a bit in the past, which is the jobs debate in this country. The jobs debate in this country is an exercise in mass fantasy. What do I mean by this? You have various political parties and interest groups, all of whom have a formula for making sure that millions of South Africans will be put back to work, as they put it. And what lies behind that is a very dangerous form of path dependency, because it is a sense that the good society will be achieved in this country when everybody here, when the entire country gets up in the morning and goes to work for some informal employer in a formal business, because that's the way it used to be in the past. And the reality is, unfortunately, I won't be around to collect, but I would bet anybody in this room, particularly the students in this room, that your grandchildren will not be living in a society where that will happen, anywhere on the planet. Okay. So we need to start talking about what is really important in the jobs debate, because we know that millions of South Africans for the foreseeable future will not be in those formal jobs. We need to have a serious discussion on how you ensure, and it can be done, that those South Africans who are not in formal jobs are actually living productive lives and contributing to their own lives and their families. And it can be done, but we can't do it as long as we persist in this fantasy that what we're trying to do is actually recreate the way in which whites conducted themselves economically before 1994. Now, I'm out of time, so I think there are 2 points I want to put on the table. One is that we need to start thinking very seriously as South Africans about how we relate to this path dependency. On the one hand, I think that we need, and I think the Minister and I would be in total agreement on this, we need to fight very hard to protect those aspects of path dependency which are important, many of which are in our Constitution. Regular elections, the rule of law, the right to speak, the right to organize, these are all very important inheritances which we not only have to protect, but which we have to try to ensure are enjoyed by more and more South Africans. On the other hand, we have to ask ourselves whether the negative path dependencies which I'm talking about are what we want to be living with over the next 20 years. Because if we are living with them in the next 20 years, no, the country is not going to go down the tubes, no, it's not going to go down in flames, but we are going to lose a lot of opportunities, and we are not going to progress as a society in the way that we could. And I think that there are 2 ways in which we need to address these path dependencies. The one is, I would side with Aubrey Machike on this issue, and I would say to the Minister, I'm afraid I don't think that we've made the kind of progress on racial issues that he suggests that we've made. I think that the kind of racial attitudes that existed in 1994 and the kind of cultural prejudices and the cultural biases that existed in there are far too much a part of our society now. And I've argued before, and I will argue again, that those of us who care about race and racism made a fundamental mistake in 1994. Because in the early 1990s, one of the things you may, or those of us who are old enough will remember, there was the beginnings of a serious attempt to talk honestly and openly about race in the society. And we lost interest in 1994 because we said the problem's solved, and the problem wasn't solved. The problem is still very much with us. The other issue is, how do you actually address this economic path dependency in a way which ensures that there's growing prosperity for all of us? And the only way in which we can, the only way in which we can do that is that we need to negotiate. And I think that just as we were able 20 years ago to negotiate a political settlement, we have still got the equally important task ahead of us, and that is, how do we negotiate over time the kind of economic compromise which will ensure that we have a market economy, but we can start moving away from these path dependencies which create a situation in which so many of us live in poverty and we have these dreadfully high levels of inequality. Thank you very much.